there's been some progress. The Fed has gone from, I think, 25 basis points to 5.25, 5.5, and that's really where they should be. I think the 25 was too low given the inflation rate got to 9.1. So.
Hello. Welcome again to the episode of the Let People Prosper show. My name is Dr. Vance Ginn. I hope you're having a prosperous day. Well, today I'm delighted to have on another guest who's been on before on the Let People Prosper show. He's someone who knows a lot about monetary policy, how the economy works, and the importance of economic freedom. And it's none other than Dr. John Taylor. John, welcome to the Let People Prosper show.
It's good to be here. Thanks, Vance.
Well, I'm glad that you're on again. It's always a pleasure to talk with you. And, I've followed your work for many years. As we were talking about before we came on, I have a stack of your books that you've edited or something else. And there's a lot of good information in there. I'll be sure to put a lot of these in the show notes page at vanceginn.substack.com. But I'm glad to have you back on. There's been a lot happened over the last year since we talked. And so this is a good time to have you back on. Before we get going, though, just for the audience, let me go ahead and give your bio, and then we'll jump right into it. So John Taylor is the Mary and Robert Raymond Professor of Economics at Stanford University and the George P. Shultz Senior Fellow in Economics at the Hoover Institution. He is director of the Stanford Introductory Economics Center. He formerly served as director of Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, where he is now a senior fellow. For 4 years, from 2001 to 2005, Taylor served as Undersecretary of Treasury for International Affairs. Previously, Taylor held positions of professor of economics at Princeton University and Columbia University. He received a BA in economics summa cum laude from Princeton University in 1968 and a PhD in economics from Stanford University in 1973. Well, when we recorded together a little over a year ago now, you told us about your motivation of what was motivating you then and kind of over time. But what's motivating you these days, John?
I'd say more of the same.
Okay.
There's been some progress. The Fed has gone from, I think, 25 basis points to 5.25, 5.5. Mm-hmm. And that's really where they should be. I think the 25 was too low given the inflation rate got to 9.1. So that was the first thing that I would bring attention to. Now they have improved a lot, and I think that's a good sign. But there's other kind of policies, too, that are important: fiscal policy, regulatory policy. But I've been pretty happy with the Fed recently. They seem back on track. We'll see if they continue with that. But that should be the focus of our discussion. Yeah,
I agree. Those are important. And when you're looking at the federal funds rate, which is the overnight lending rate between banks, they have a target. The Federal Reserve has a target for what that overnight lending rate between banks would be. And as you said, I mean, they kept it 0 to 0.25%. Kind of this range is what they've been doing for a while now. They kept it there until, July of 2022, and then they raised it a number of times to where it is today at 5.25 to 5.5%. And I was looking at this, and I'll put it in the show notes, where the Atlanta Fed has this Taylor rule to utility and kind of compares the federal funds rate with the Taylor rule. And then they use different types of metrics. I don't know, you might have a specific one that you like better than others, which would be good to talk about. But they were well below the Taylor rule sort of, which is really just a basis of looking at inflation expectations and the output gap, something along those lines, and says, okay, what should the Taylor rule or what should the federal funds rate be? And so they kept it so low for so long, John. I wonder what your thoughts are about what's happened over the last couple of years and where we are now.
Well, I think the Fed itself has caught up a lot. I think the Atlanta Fed is not the only bank out there that's keeping track of the so-called Taylor rule. It's been around 30 years or so.
Yep.
And what's remarkable is the Fed has it in their reports, the Federal Reserve in Washington. And a lot of other central banks are paying attention. I talk to governors a lot, and they are paying attention. But for a while, they took it out, put it in, took it out. Now it's back in again. And I think they're paying more attention to it. So that's a factor. I think that's why they're closer than they were a while ago. And so that's very important to. And we could talk a little bit more about that, but I think that's the way the Fed should be going.
Yeah, I think that's right. And we saw that during what's been called the Great Moderation in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s. But then there was this period in the mid 2000s where they held it too low for too long, the federal funds rate, especially compared with the Taylor rule. And so I wonder if we might see some of the same effects or same repercussions of keeping the Fed funds rate too low for too long, like we did during the 2000s?
I don't think so.
Okay.
We don't know for sure. We're not pulling the trigger.
Yeah.
But as far as I can tell, there's more paying attention to this rate, and it's not just the Fed, of course. It's other central banks as well. But I think the fact the Fed is back on track, they apparently may be slightly too high, but not much. They might come down later this week. Mm-hmm. But I think the fact is that they have improved a lot, and Jay Powell talks about it. John Williams talks about the New York Fed, and so John Williams is a student here, by the way, and they have paid a lot of attention to that. I think that's important, quite frankly. As you mentioned, the Taylor rule is very simple. It has a 2% inflation target.
Yeah,
it's not bad. They're above 2, maybe they're 3.5, so they have a ways to go, and they're on the way, I believe. But don't forget the rest of the world. We have to get the rest of the world back online as well.
And how does that work? From thinking about the Taylor rule, the Fed funds rate here, which has an influence on the rest of the world, speaking of the rest of the world, but you also have the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, you have others that are key measures that are out there. Those are the big ones. What does that transmission mechanism really look like from your perspective on looking at the rest of the world and how it influences the United States and other countries?
Well, it's a very good question. I think the main thing, and I hate to be focusing on this too much, but if every central bank had a Taylor rule in mind, 2% inflation target, even Russia and China, then I think we'd be in better shape. And Europe is getting close to that. Latin America is a ways from it. Maybe Japan's coming towards that. And the U.S. is certainly closer than they were a year and a half ago. So I think that's a good sign. And it's simple, 2% inflation target. What's so bad about that? And the unemployment rate will matter a little bit. It's the state of the economy. But I think it's a pretty simple idea, and it's been around a long time. We've seen dangers when we deviated from it too much, and we've been on track pretty well when we have been close to it. So maybe there can be. It's not perfect, that's for sure. There's only 2 variables, and the exchange rate is the other thing that other central banks should be paying more attention to, perhaps.
Yes, that's true. I wonder, John, whenever you were writing this, 30 years ago plus, and really doing a lot of research on it, if you look back and you think about now, when I was in grad school, it was, and even undergrad too, there's a lot of talk about the Taylor rule. And I wonder, when you hear the Taylor rule now, thinking back 30 plus years ago, whenever you were doing this, would you have imagined that it would be called the Taylor rule today?
No.
Yeah.
No. But I've always been interested in rules, so to speak. Back in, I did a undergraduate, as you mentioned before, I went to Princeton and did an undergraduate thesis on rules. It was and then I did my PhD thesis on rules, where you didn't know the parameters, you had to figure out what to do. But in some sense, that's way back.
Yeah. It's
a long time ago. And then it became more and more important. First, they were very complicated, too complicated, then they were too simple. But what has pleased me, I think, to some extent, is that the other central banks know about it. There's a lot of discussion about it. I mean, virtually every central banker in the world knows about it. Mm-hmm. And so there's a way to have a discussion, which is sensible. The inflation target, 2%, what to do if the inflation gets too high, how much do you tighten policy, what about the unemployment rate? And I think those are the things we should be thinking about. Maybe there's others, but we've narrowed down to those 2, and it's worked pretty well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and it really does help with the discussion of really framing where we should be, where we should not be, in particular what the trade-offs are, right? Because we know if we keep interest rates too low for too long, there are going to be distortions in the marketplace. There's something else that's not quite fitting correctly, and while in some sense the Taylor rule is pretty simple, in a complex world, to your point, it's not perfect, but it does get a lot of the key ingredients, I think, for a well-functioning marketplace, and especially for the Fed not to be manipulating things too much with their open market operations and everything else. And so I think it really sets forth a good guide that's out there. Because as you know, John, I'm big on rules as well. I think whether it's politicians or central bankers, they have limited knowledge. And so we need something that also holds them in check for the society at large, right?
I think that's right. That's the advantage of some rule anyway. And what rule you have makes a difference. I've been interested in rules all my life.
Yeah.
And I think that this is a simple one. It's not the money growth, it's the interest rate.
Yeah.
And Milton Friedman was a good friend. He was out here for a while before he passed away. George Shultz as well. And so I learned a lot from them about a policy, about how to conduct policy. And Milton Friedman had this growth rate rule. And in some sense, the tail rule is related to that.
Yep.
It's a way we just look at the interest rate. And don't forget the money supply.
No. That's right.
You can't forget. It's very important to keep in mind.
Well, that's exactly right. And, I'm a big fan of Milton Friedman. I've learned a lot from him as well, through my education and still learning a lot in the process. And I do look a lot at the Fed's balance sheet. One of the things that we saw not only during the Great Financial Crisis or the Great Recession period was a substantial increase from quantitative easing, buying a lot of other types of assets, mortgage-backed securities, commercial paper. I mean, there was a lot of things they added on to it compared to just Treasury securities that had been the normal for so long. And so that it ballooned the Fed's balance sheet. And then it started to come down a little bit, 2017, I think it was 2018, 2019, right before the pandemic. But it was still $4 trillion compared to about $800 billion before the Great Financial Crisis. And but then with the shutdowns and the debt that increased during that period of COVID and the lockdowns, we saw it go from $4 trillion to $9 trillion. Now it's back to around $7.6 trillion. So it has come down some. But I'm still concerned, John. I wonder where you're at on this, is that there's still inflationary pressures that are out there, given the amount of money that's been put into the economy. Yes, it's coming back down, but we're still $3+ trillion compared to where we were in 2020. And in some sense, I don't want us to fall into this idea that, look, everything is fine now. Inflation, we have disinflation now. The rate's coming down, not deflation. Because that's what we saw during the 70s was kind of a dip, and then it came back up. And I hope that we've learned those lessons, but the balance sheet is something that's really important, right?
It's very important.
Yep.
And I think they've moved away from that and they're focused on the interest rate, maybe a little bit on the money supply, but on the interest rate, I think that's very healthy.
Yeah.
And as the economy grows, the balance sheet will be less important, relatively speaking. And so I think that's the way to go. I think they realize that the funds rate is a good thing to focus on. It gets distracted. There's other people. A lot of people don't know about monetary policy that are kibitzing and weighing in. So the Fed, other central banks need to be worried about that too. But I think you're right. You should focus on really what matters. And our models, our theories, our ideas are that the interest rate, which affects the long rate, affects other exchange rate, is part of the mechanism.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good point. And I wonder, when we're looking at different types of rules, you said the money growth rule, the Taylor rule, looking more at the federal funds rate, what that should be over time, looking at inflation targeting for a rule of 2%. There's also the connection now that John Cochran, one of your colleagues there at the Hoover Institution, I had him on. He's a former guest here on the IPO Prosper Show. We had a great discussion about his book on the fiscal theory of the price level and talking about the connection between deficits and debt and the expectations of debt for the future, and then how that can influence inflationary pressures. I wonder, though, what your thoughts are on that. Do you see a similar connection as what John Cochran does, or something a little different?
So I think the fiscal policy is important, no question about it, but so is regulatory policy. So the other rule of law is very important to keep in mind. But I think at this point we've seen that the inflation rate has come down, and it will come down further. I believe it was over 9%.
Yeah.
And we'll see if it gets to 2, but that's really money growth.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I tend to focus on. It's not that you can ignore fiscal policy, because if the deficits are big, the Fed has to worry about that. Interest rates will drive interest rates up or down. And so it's important. But I think the main thing is, look, I've stressed there's 5 things: predictive policy framework, rule of law, strong markets, reliance on markets as well, and clear role of government. And so fiscal policy is part of that, but it's not the only thing. And I think don't forget regulatory policy. It's awfully important.
Yeah.
But I think right now we've seen the trick of getting monetary policy online, and the inflation rate's coming down to 2. We'll see if it gets all the way. and it's not a little over 3. But that seems to be in the right direction. Now, fiscal policy is very important. I don't want to ignore that. But it seems to me we have to consider all these policies together.
Yeah, it's a great point. And one of the things I think we saw, during the Trump administration, the earlier years, not 2020, but before 2020, a big part of the reason for increased economic growth and productivity, part of it was the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Don't get me wrong. I think lowering the corporate income tax rate from 35% to 21% was huge, but also there was more predictability about regulations. To your point about regulatory policy, getting that right, I think that also helped to change the expectations for businesses' profitability and their cost structure for the future. That really helped them to invest and grow their businesses here in America faster. I don't know what you see about that.
No, I think that's very important. We think we should think of policy, monetary policy, as part of it.
Yeah,
fiscal policy, regulatory policy, and international policy as well. But I think to get those all in line is important. It's not just one; it's all of them together.
Yeah.
And what really as you mentioned before, economic freedom maybe is a catch-all term that refers to all these things. And the rest of the world has a lot of way to go. We're not really there yet. But I think that if the Fed, especially if it continues on the policy that it's begun to be on, maybe we should get to 4% interest rate. But I think that's the way to move. And once we do that, there'll be less incentives for Europe, UK, Latin America, and other countries, in Africa as well, to get off track. And I think that what you need is some kind of leader, some kind of, maybe role is the way to put it, but some kind of strategy that the central banks are using.
Yeah. And whenever we're looking at the federal funds rate now, 5.25% to 5.5%, I know there's been expectations that they were going to start lowering rates maybe even earlier this year. That hasn't happened so far. You've indicated maybe they might later this week, which we're recording this on March 4th, 2024. There's other expectations that it'll be this summer, given what comes in of that they'll cut it. But I think what I've seen, John, so far is maybe 3 cuts this year.
Maybe I can't really. I don't know. I'm happy that they're where they are. I don't want to get to 3% or 4%, but I think they've moved up a lot. It wasn't easy to do, and the question is where the Fed is going. But I don't think they're going to do a whole lot.
Yeah. That makes sense. I think you're right. And and going back to the fiscal policy for a little bit, I mean, when you look at the CBO's projections over the next decade, which are kind of rosy projections, like there's no other recessions or nothing else that they can expect outside of just normal growth, which is still pretty slow growth, but normal growth. They're expecting about $20 trillion added to the national debt. It's about $2 trillion in deficits per year. So this is not going away.
No.
And you only have a couple of ways to pay for it. Issue more debt. Okay, we can do that. You could raise taxes, which very few seem to want to do. And if you look at some of the work by Albert Alessina and some of your work as well, raising taxes does not help with deficits because it slows economic growth. I mean, maybe on paper it will, but we need to look at the dynamic effects. But you also could cut spending or rein government spending in, which I think is the best case scenario. We just need some sort of fiscal rule as well as the monetary rule. Or you could print money and keep running up in inflation. And so it's going to be interesting to see, John, over the next few years of keeping the Fed on track while also being able to fund the deficits and debt if we're not going to get that fiscal part under control. There's this fiscal commission, which maybe it'll be good. I'm a little bit concerned because they're already talking about, raising taxes. But I wonder from your perspective, John, looking at this of a number of years, a number of administrations, maybe what's the best case scenario? Like what would you give as examples or ideas, recommendations for influencers that are out there?
We've talked about monetary policy, and I think that's pretty clear. Fiscal policy, why not balance the budget on average?
Yeah.
Why not come in that direction? There's pressures against that, and there's different theories about it. But I think that's what I would suggest. Maybe have a surplus and deficit in good times and bad times. But I think that's the way to go. But you left out regulatory policy.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
It's very important to get that right.
Yeah.
And in a way, let me say, I think we should have a growth rate target, maybe 3%, maybe 4%, which is comparable to what the U.S. has to do. We have a lot of poverty in America. It's increased a lot. We need to worry about that. And it's all over the place. And so I think if we have a higher growth rate, we'll be able to do a better job on unemployment. And it's, inflation is not the only thing, that's for sure. And one of the reasons to have a rule or a strategy is you don't have these big cutbacks. And I think one of the good things about the last year and a half is we haven't had a recession. We've had some slow growth, but it hasn't been bad. And I think that's the thing to avoid. And I think going forward, it's not just monetary policy, it's fiscal policy. I don't see why we can't have a balanced budget over time for fiscal policy. It's not that hard.
Yeah.
It was hard, I guess. But it's an important part of what we should be doing.
Yeah, I agree with you, John. And one thing we look at is 50 states. We've got this laboratory of competition among the states, and each state has a balanced budget amendment where they have to balance their budget every time, which I think is really important about keeping them all in line. I have some reservations about a balanced budget amendment at the federal level. I think we need to focus on the spending side and not necessarily just the tax side, but that would put us in a much better position than what we've been in for quite a while.
I agree. I agree with that.
Yeah.
But you're right. The states are very important. California is not the greatest in the world at this point, and we have some states that are better, some states that are worse.
Yep.
I've lived in a few. I was born in Pennsylvania. No, I was born in New York. Sorry.
Okay. Well, I'm in Texas, so they get a lot of stuff right in Texas, especially when you think about regulatory policy, tax policy. No personal income tax, I think, is huge, and then in spending too. They have done a better job. Not this past year, they increased spending just in the state funds by about 30%. So it was a massive increase. We have a biennial legislature in Texas, so that's on a biennial 2-year basis, but still it was a massive increase. And so I'm concerned about some of these things, like in Texas, where you have a growth in revenue, and then you want to spend every dollar instead of giving that money back. I kind of like what Colorado's Taxpayer Bill of Rights did, where it said, look, we're going to limit spending to population growth plus inflation, and then we're going to refund the money back if we have excess. I would rather them put that money to lowering tax rates instead of giving a refund. Stop taking so much on the front end instead of trying to get it back on the back end. But maybe we can get that happening more across the states. And that would be a huge way for more pro-growth policy.
I think so. And I think your word at the end there, pro-growth, is important. Why do we want to have this good policy? We want to have fewer business cycles, but we want to have stronger growth. And we could have stronger growth with the right kind of policies. They've not been the greatest. A lot of regulatory policy, and monetary policy has not been great until recently. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
But I think the goal should be a higher growth rate for the economy.
Yeah.
And why not have the world as a higher growth rate?
Yeah, I agree.
A lot of around the world.
One thing we're getting into here, John, is the election year. We got a presidential election. We've got Super Tuesday coming up tomorrow, and things that are going on. And I wanted to kind of maybe get your thoughts on this. Don't have to get political or anything, but I think in general, the pro-growth messages that are going on. One of the things that kind of concerns me is that there's not this hopeful, bold vision for the future. There's more about one side fighting against the other and the other side fighting against the other. And it's difficult to see as much from the front runners about this like bold, hopeful vision. But I wonder what your take is, what's going on so far.
Well, I think they've shied away from that.
Yeah.
And why not think about tax cuts that increase growth? Why not think about less regulation that we think growth? The word economic freedom used to be used a lot. It's not used much anymore. So those are the goals. They really haven't changed. They've been successful when they've been used. Yeah. So I'd like to get back to that a little bit, both sides, if you like. If maybe there's three sides, all the people who could weigh in on this, and then, of course the states are important as well. But I come back to the world again. I mean, let's get the world on track, and I think we'd be better off why not have a 2% target globally?
Yeah.
And then we have the right kind of policy that goes along with that.
Yeah. I guess we have to be careful about any sort of global bank or global taxes, but they could all be deciding these things and work on rules together at the same time. There's going to be some sort of relationship of what they're doing anyway.
Well, this idea of a policy rule is still relatively new.
Yeah.
And most central bankers know about that. but especially with the interest rate, is new. And so there's more talk about that. The Bank of Canada, ECB, et cetera, Bank of England. And so I think that's the thing to encourage. It's hard to do that, but it's very important to do that. I think we should try to do that more. The more we can, the better. And I think that's we know it from a monetary side that that's a successful formula for growth. We know that.
Yeah. And we've heard a lot, and we will later this week, actually, the State of the Union by President Biden will be here, and there'll be talk about Bidenomics and the benefits and the successes of it and everything else. And I don't, whenever I look at the headlines seem good. 3.7% unemployment rate. We've been under 4% for a while. The last month, the previous month, there was a job growth of over 300,000. That seems robust. But, John, I know that you also look underneath the hood, though. We can't just look at the headlines. And if you look under the hood, I think there are weaknesses that are out there. I mean, one thing I see is that, yes, the establishment survey showed 300,000 jobs that were added. But if you look at the household survey, it was down 31,000. And in three of the last 5 months, there's been declining employment when you look at the household survey, and those have really broken apart. There's been a divergence between establishment survey numbers and household survey numbers since about March of 2022. And the household survey are well below what the non-farm are showing now. And I wonder if some of that has to do with some people are just taking on multiple jobs. That will be reflected in the establishment survey, but only one job in the household survey to keep up with inflation. Real wages are down about 4.4% since January of 2021 when Biden came in. And so I see some of these weaknesses that seem to reflect more of what Americans are feeling, but I wonder what some of the other things that you've been looking at.
Well, those are the same kind of things. You by the way, show a great mastery of the numbers, but I think that it's important to keep those in mind.
Yeah.
The numbers that bother me a lot is the poverty numbers.
Yeah.
They're go to San Francisco, you see a lot of tents. Even close to where we live here, we see tents. And so that's not the greatest. Texas, I don't know about Texas. Probably not so many. But the border is an issue.
Yep.
Well, the Mexicans coming in and other borders as well. So I think those are the international issues that are not directly related to economics, but they're not unrelated either. So I would say get the growth rate 3-4%, and then think about the immigration issues a little bit. Think about the regulatory issues, and those are all very important. You know the numbers very well, but you, especially in Texas, you should know about the migration issue. There are many coming in. We read about it every day, no matter what paper you read. Yeah,
it's true. And as we're wrapping up here, John, it's always a great discussion. I'd rather talk to you all day. Maybe we should get together sometime soon and do that. I think some of the issues that I also see going forward, speaking of more globally and international, are trade. There's a lot of talk about protectionism these days. There's talk by former President Trump, GOP nominee, about a 10% tariff on everything. Just to be frank about it, I worked in the Trump administration, but those were the issues that I was opposed to. Those are the things that I was trying to educate others internally on the benefits of trade. But you had Peter Navarro and Lighthizer and others who had a different perspective on those things, just a little bit. And so I'm concerned about that. And also from the right, John, we've seen like this national conservatism, the NatCons, if you will, that have come in and kind of had this bigger government sort of approach. If we just have the right people in power, we can do more with the government than not. And I'm really concerned about what this direction is going. It's not the old Reagan, Milton Friedman sort of approach anymore. We're seeing this new direction. And I wonder what your thoughts are on all this.
So my view is economic freedom is the way to proceed. Milton Friedman was out here. George Shultz was out here. George had four cabinet positions. And so we know that works. And we know that what doesn't work. And I think globally speaking, we need to educate. You're great. You had the experience. I actually think the experience is very important. I've had down in the Navy, I had 4, maybe 5, I don't know, a lot of experience in DC and other parts of the world too. And so I think that's a very important, the experience that you've had, and hey, I tried this, it doesn't work, or here's what you need to persuade people. And the more that we can do that, the better. I think it's not the greatest of shape right now. I'm noticing a little bit from the academic world, but also the policy world, that we're drifting away from those things. We don't hear so much about, hey, why don't we have a 4% growth target? Have you heard that recently? And I think the unemployment, as you mentioned, is very important, but we also have a lot of poverty. So there's a lot of things that we could be doing locally, immigration-wise, that we should continue to try to do, but we can do better. We could the five principles, I guess, of economic freedom, which I've stressed, are important to keep out there and keep going with. And also, I think, as you have shown, the fact that you're not only a commentator and a great commentator, you get involved. And I think that people forget that. And it's very important to do that. It's internationally as well. We have to talk about the World Bank or the IMF. That's another global aspect of this.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. I appreciate everything that you're doing too, John. I mean, we've got our work cut out for us, and I just wanted to mention a couple things real quick, is that for the audience, Choose Economic Freedom. I'm showing it here if you're just listening, but that's a good one with Taylor. And there's how monetary policy got behind the curve and how to get back. There's another one that he has recently on this, and another one too that I think is a good short read for the audience, but has, to your point, the 5 key principles is first principles, 5 keys to restoring America's prosperity. Because I think you're exactly right. It's one reason why, John, I came up with this Let People Prosper show, and kind of my mantra and my calling card, and what I feel is God's calling for my life is to let people prosper, is to get government out of the way. And that means spiritually, materially, physically, whatever it is. I mean, we need more freedom, because that is ultimately what's going to give us liberty, personal responsibility, and the ability to improve. The more handouts we give, and to your point, we have a lot of people still in poverty that have learned to live off of safety net programs. Not as a hand up, but as something that to continue to be on. And that doesn't breed work. It doesn't breed prosperity and allow them to have long-term self-sufficiency. And so these ideas that you're talking about and espousing are like the 4% growth, I think is huge. Regulatory, fiscal, and monetary policy, all of these things need to be getting done right, not only at the federal level, but across the states and even globally. I think this discussion today has really brought that all together. And so I appreciate what you're doing there. Are there any big projects that you're working on now that you could mention, or other things that you'd like to close us out with?
The thing that I'm most interested in now is having the rule apply more broadly.
Okay.
We seem to have caught up in the U.S. And we're positive about it. Jay Powell's positive about it. He's back in the swing of things in the reports, but we still don't have a universal. It looks like Japan's coming back. It looks like Europe's coming back, but there's still Africa, there's still Latin America, and there's still Russia and China. And so I think the more that we talk, that's what I'm interested in now, quite frankly. It's worked here. We've been talking about a long time. It's periods where it's worked, where it's not worked. Yeah. I think we ought to do that. Maybe the exchange rate should be more important in certain countries. Maybe they don't have an independent central bank like the U.S. The ECB, of course, is many countries together. So there's a lot to do, and I've been interested in that a long time. I've written books about it. You didn't mention that, but that's okay.
Yeah.
But I think, and I have this one here.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. Choose economic freedom, right?
Yes, that's the game.
That's right. I like that one a lot. Yes. Okay. That's exactly right. And I wonder what your thoughts are. Just kind of wrap it up here now. Is on Javier Milei in Argentina and some of the things that's going on there. What are your thoughts on that so far?
So I think he's going in the right direction. It may be too fast, but let's leave it to them. I think they've got to do that. But it's not just Argentina; it's Chile, it's Brazil, and so I think there's a long way to go. But I think it's promising. I think what's happening globally is promising. I think maybe that's what you asked. One of your questions is that. What are my assumptions about how the world works? Yeah. I think how the world works is we have leaders like that in Japan as well. And I think let's see what happens in the other parts of the world. But I think that's very important. That's a step in the right direction. We've had bigger steps in the past and we've drifted away. But now the opportunity is to come back and to do the right thing, so to speak. And I think that's what I'm hopeful will happen. We'll see.
That's great. Well, I'm glad to end on an optimistic note. Even given the challenges that are facing, we can still find optimism of what's going on. And so thank you, John, for all you do. And God bless you and your family.
Thank you, Vance. The same to you.
Thank you so
Good
much.
luck, thanks.
Well, I appreciate that. I'm going to keep working on it here. For the audience, please go out and give us a 5-star rating wherever you're listening or watching this at. Share with your friends and family. They might like it too, because there's a lot of good information that we need to get out there as much as possible. And you can find all the show notes at vanceginn.substack.com or my website, vanceginn.com. And until next time, let people prosper.